In July 1984, a small private plane lifted off from a quiet airfield in New Jersey. On board were 32-year-old James Whitman, a wealthy businessman who loved to fly, and his wife, 29-year-old Isabella. It was supposed to be a simple trip south, a short flight toward North Carolina for a summer holiday. James had trained as a part-time pilot and often flew himself. That afternoon, weather conditions were clear. The flight plan was filed. Nothing suggested danger. Yet less than an hour after takeoff, the plane's signal vanished from radar. Search teams moved quickly. Helicopters swept over the Appalachian mountains. Ground crews combed through valleys and forests. No wreckage, no distress call, no trace of the couple. For weeks, the search dominated headlines. Families watched nightly news reports that spoke of a percent flight gone cold. Speculation spread almost immediately. Was it a crash in the wilderness, or something far darker? James had recently changed his will. Isabella stood to inherit a large sum if anything happened to him. Their marriage, while outwardly happy, was rumored to have financial tension. Investigators looked in every direction: business rivals, old friends. Even maintenance staff at the hangar came under suspicion. But without a plane, without bodies, there was no evidence to confirm anything. By the end of that year, the search was called off. The case was filed as a cold disappearance. For decades, the fate of James and Isabella haunted the Whitman family and fueled endless theories. People whispered about staged vanishings, fraud, or sabotage. Others believed the couple simply crashed into the mountains, swallowed forever by the wilderness. Then, nearly 4 decades later, hunters deep in the Appalachians stumbled upon twisted metal. Within days, news broke across the country. The missing plane had finally been found. This was no accident lost to time. Forensic evidence would reveal the truth behind a disappearance that had left more questions than answers. Before we move into the investigation and the people drawn into suspicion, what do you think happened in those final minutes of flight? Leave your thoughts below, and let's... James Whitman was 32 years old in the summer of 1984. He was the eldest son in a wealthy New York family and the main heir to a fortune built on international trade. He managed the family's import-export company and carried the reputation of a young businessman with power, confidence, and ambition. Friends described him as sharp and determined, sometimes even stubborn. He liked to be in control. Flying was one of his passions. James was not a professional pilot, but he had taken courses and earned a private pilot license. For him, flying a small plane was more than transportation. It was freedom. He often used his Cessna for weekend trips, confident in his own ability to handle the skies. But that confidence, some said, bordered on recklessness. A few friends admitted they were nervous whenever James insisted on flying instead of booking a commercial flight. Behind the business success and adventurous lifestyle, there were personal complications. Just before the trip that would end in tragedy, James revised his will. The new document named his wife Isabella as the primary beneficiary. His younger sister Emily Whitman would inherit second if anything happened to Isabella. Family members noticed the change immediately. It created tension. Emily was outspoken about money and did not hide her resentment, especially when James insisted he would control the family estate. Isabella Martinez Whitman was 29. Born to a Spanish immigrant family, she worked as an interior designer in Manhattan. She was described as stylish, clever, and ambitious in her own way. Friends admired her charm and sense of independence, but also noticed how much pressure she carried after marrying into the Whitman fortune. James and Isabella met at an art exhibition in Manhattan. The connection was quick, almost too quick. Within 14 months, they were married in a ceremony that made the society pages. Their marriage was often described as glamorous, but not without cracks. Those closest to them said arguments about money were common. James controlled most of the finances, and Isabella sometimes fought back. According to one guest at a party, their arguments could be sharp. "He wanted everything his way," the guest recalled. She wasn't afraid to challenge him. Flying a week before they vanished, James and Isabella hosted a gathering at their townhouse. Dozens of guests remembered the atmosphere as lively, but not without tension. Several people noticed the couple arguing openly about spending habits and control over household finances. According to one witness, the argument ended with Isabella saying sharply, "You think money buys everything, but it doesn't buy respect." James reportedly snapped back, "Respect comes with authority, and I have it." Moments like these were remembered long after their disappearance. For investigators, they became part of the larger puzzle. A wealthy couple, a new will, money disputes, and a sudden flight that ended in mystery. James's love for aviation stood in contrast to Isabella's fear. He believed in his own skills. She doubted them. That dynamic, confidence against caution, hung over their final days. Some friends thought James was too proud to admit limits, while others said Isabella only went along to keep the peace. Their lives represented two very different worlds coming together: the established wealth of New York business and the modest background of a Spanish immigrant family. To outsiders, they were a striking pair, admired and envied. Inside their marriage, however, there were arguments that would later fuel rumors of betrayal, greed, and hidden motives. In the end, James and Isabella were more than victims of a missing plane. They were a couple whose personal choices, financial arrangements, and family tensions created a backdrop that investigators could not ignore. Their disappearance wasn't just about a flight gone wrong. It was about everything leading up to it. July 10, 1984. A summer morning in Manhattan. James Whitman, 32, and his wife Isabella, 29, stepped out of their apartment on East 73rd Street. Neighbors later recalled the sight. James carried two small travel bags, smiling, energized, talking fast. Isabella walked a step behind. Her face seemed tense, lips pressed tight. One neighbor told police, "She didn't look excited about the trip." James was the only one talking. When investigators retraced the timeline later, they found several key details in those final hours. Michael Turner, the airport mechanic, confirmed that he had isked to Cessna just days earlier. "Everything looked fine," he said. "No leaks, no damage, nothing to suggest trouble." Yet another airport employee gave a statement that would gain new meaning decades later. He thought he saw a woman near the hangar earlier that week, a woman resembling Emily Whitman, James's younger sister. At the time, no one connected her to the flight. Weather reports showed clear skies that Tuesday, light winds, no storms on radar. In short, it was a perfect day for flying. At 4:50 p.m., James called a friend from a payphone at the airport. He said he and Isabella were headed south for a short getaway in North Carolina. He sounded upbeat, confident. Isabella, witnesses recalled, was quiet. A friend of hers told reporters later, she always hated flying. She used to say she felt trapped in the air. But she wanted to keep the peace with James, so she went along. By 5 p.m., the Cessna rolled down the runway. Witnesses saw James at the controls, Isabella sitting in the co-pilot's seat. The plane lifted smoothly into the summer sky. Air traffic control confirmed the ascent. The Cessna climbed to about 7,000 feet. Communication was routine. No signs of stress. No warnings. At 5:20 p.m., the aircraft was recorded flying steadily over the northern Appalachian range. Controllers noted the heading was exactly as filed. No detours, no problems. There was no emergency call, no signal of distress. Everything seemed normal. Then came 5:42 p.m. The exact time burned into the official record. On the radar screen, the small green dot representing James and Isabella simply vanished. 1 second it was there, moving on course. The next, gone. No fade, no gradual drop. Just a sudden disappearance. Controllers expected the plane to reappear. They checked for errors. They tried to raise James on radio frequencies. Nothing. The silence was complete. Within the hour, emergency procedures were activated. Civil search teams pressed on for weeks. Tips poured in. Several hikers claimed to see smoke columns in the distance. Others said they heard what might have been an engine sputtering. Each lead was checked. Each led nowhere. Investigators were puzzled by one crucial detail. Normally, when a small plane crashes, searchers find debris, broken wings, scattered metal, some trace of fuel. In this case, nothing surfaced. It was as if the Cessna had been swallowed by the mountains. By August, with no evidence recovered, the search was scaled back. The official report filed by the National Transportation Safety Board described the incident as unexplained disappearance. The word accident was not used. It was simply logged as missing, presumed lost. This conclusion did little to satisfy the families. The Whitmans wanted answers. They wanted to know how a skilled amateur pilot and his young wife could disappear without a trace on a clear summer afternoon. Isabella's family in New York pushed for more searching, but funding dried up. The case slowly slipped into the realm of mystery. Still, investigators noted inconsistencies. Why had there been no distress call? Even in a sudden mechanical failure, most pilots have seconds to send out a mayday. Why did the radar track vanish so abruptly, with no fading signal? The questions lingered, unresolved. Rumors began filling the vacuum left by the lack of evidence. Some pointed to James's business rivalries, suggesting sabotage. Others whispered about Isabella's past friendships, hinting at jealousy or scandal. Mechanics at the airfield became the subject of gossip. Every angle was considered, but none could be proven. The most haunting detail of all was that official records still placed the last known location of James and Isabella at 5:42 p.m., July 10th, 1984. A precise minute, marked forever as the moment a marriage trip turned into a mystery. That timestamp would remain frozen for 36 years, the point at which 2 lives vanished into silence. In the absence of wreckage, in the absence of bodies, the case was left to gather dust. When the search for James and Isabella's missing plane dragged on with no results, investigators faced a troubling truth. Weeks of combing the Appalachian wilderness had turned up nothing. No wreckage, no signals, no survivors. By the late summer of 1984, the official story was shifting. This wasn't just a simple aviation accident. Something darker might have happened before the plane ever left the ground. A key question began to haunt investigators and the public alike. Was this truly a tragic disappearance? Or had someone sabotaged the aircraft? The absence of a distress call was a turning point. Experienced pilots, even under severe mechanical stress, almost always radio a mayday. James Whitman's Cessna vanished in silence, as if its systems failed instantly. To aviation experts, that silence suggested something deliberate. With pressure mounting, police began to look at the people closest to James and Isabella. 3 names emerged. 3 people with history, with motives, and with public arguments that could not be ignored. The press seized on it quickly. Headlines screamed, 3 men, 3 motives. Richard Hale had once been James Whitman's closest ally. They co-founded Whitman and Hale Imports, a shipping and logistics company that handled everything from European textiles to South American produce. For years, the 2 men were inseparable, working side by side, building contracts worth millions. But by 1983, their friendship had collapsed. Disputes over money, shipping routes, and risky investments pushed them apart. Several employees later recalled shouting matches in the office that shook the walls. One secretary remembered an especially heated argument just weeks before the disappearance. Richard stormed into James's office, slamming a file on the desk. His voice was loud enough that staff outside heard every word. "You're running this company into the ground," Richard shouted. James fired back. "I built this business, not you. If you don't like how I run it, walk away." Richard's reply was scathing. "You arrogant—" The second name on the suspect list was Victor Klein. He had known Isabella years before she married James. They met in college, where rumors suggested a brief relationship that fizzled but never quite ended in friendship. Victor stayed in Isabella's orbit, occasionally appearing at social gatherings and dinners. To James, that lingering connection was a source of tension. One witness recalled a confrontation at a party only weeks before the flight. James and Victor clashed in front of a stunned group of guests. Victor leaned in, his voice sharp and mocking. "She deserves better than you, James." James snapped back instantly. "Stay the hell away from my wife!" Victor didn't hold back. He laughed bitterly and said, "You think money makes you a man? You don't even see she's miserable." James, red-faced, shot back, "If you ever interfere again, you'll regret it." The room went silent. Isabella tried to calm both men, but the damage was done. Everyone present left with the impression that James and Victor's hostility was at a breaking point. When the Cessna disappeared, whispers began. Could Victor, driven by jealousy or unresolved feelings for Isabella, have had a hand in it? Victor denied everything. He claimed he hadn't spoken to Isabella in months before the incident. Still, people remembered that argument. His reputation as a jealous rival stuck, and for years afterward, many whispered his name whenever the Whitman disappearance came up. The third suspect wasn't a businessman or a friend. He was a working-class mechanic named Michael Turner. Turner was the man responsible for servicing the Whitman's Cessna 210. He worked at the small New Jersey airfield where James stored the plane. By his account, he had inspected the aircraft only days before the fatal flight and found nothing unusual. But soon, rumors began to swirl. Some said Michael had a gambling problem. Others said he owed money to the wrong people. That made him vulnerable, a man who might be bribed to look the other way, or worse, to tamper with the plane. A heated exchange between James and Michael also came to light. A hangar worker recalled James berating the mechanic only a week before takeoff. James, frustrated by delays in maintenance, allegedly shouted, "You're sloppy, Michael. If you can't do the job right, I'll find someone else." Michael, defensive and angry, shot back, "I don't take orders from spoiled rich boys. You think you own the damn airport?" James stepped closer, pointing a finger. "Touch my plane the wrong way, and you're finished." Witnesses remembered the shouting echoing across the hangar. To investigators, this fight painted a dangerous picture. A mechanic with access to the plane. A mechanic who had been humiliated publicly. A man with both opportunity and motive. Michael denied any wrongdoing. He told police he had no reason to hurt James or Isabella. But suspicion stuck. Even decades later, some in the community still believed Michael Turner had blood on his hands. With 3 suspects, 3 motives, and 3 bitter confrontations. The investigation quickly turned into a circus. Richard Hale, the embittered business partner. Victor Klein, the jealous old flame. Michael Turner, the angry mechanic with access. Each man was dragged into the spotlight. Each was questioned relentlessly. None could produce airtight alibis. The press fueled the fire, painting lurid pictures of betrayal, greed, and jealousy. Magazine covers and nightly news segments all asked the same question. Which man brought down the Whitman's plane? But there was a problem. No wreckage. No forensic evidence. No way. The phrase, 3 men, 3 motives, stuck in the public imagination. The trio became villains in a mystery without resolution. And yet, despite the years of suspicion, the truth remained hidden. Each man insisted on his innocence. Each man carried the weight of accusation. And with no hard evidence, the case eventually went cold. By the mid-1980s, investigators had little choice but to halt their inquiries. The suspects were scrutinized, their lives destroyed, but no charges were filed. What remained was an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Richard, Victor, Michael. 3 names etched into the narrative of a disappearance that refused to be solved. Decades later, when the wreckage of James and Isabella's plane was finally discovered, the truth would shock everyone. But in 1984, suspicion was all the world had, and it was enough to ruin lives. The mystery of James and Isabella's flight didn't end with rumors. Decades later, deep in the wilderness, hunters stumbled upon a chilling discovery. A broken aircraft, a silent cockpit, and the first real clues in nearly 40 years. What did investigators find inside that wreckage? And how did it rewrite everything the world thought it knew? Stay with me as we move into Part 5 and beyond, where the case goes cold and then, against all odds, explodes back into the headlines. By the mid-1980s, the investigation into the missing Cessna and the disappearance of James and Isabella Whitman had run dry. For months, teams had scoured the skies and the rugged Appalachian terrain. Aircraft, helicopters, ground crews, even trained dogs were deployed. Every lead turned into a dead end. There were no confirmed sightings, no debris fields, no floating wreckage, and no signals on emergency frequencies. It was as if the plane had been erased. In 1985, investigators reluctantly shifted the case status from active search to open missing persons file. The announcement made national headlines. Suspicion fell heavily on Isabella, the young widow. With no wreckage and no proof of an accident, whispers began to grow. Did she know more than she admitted? Had she benefited too much from the updated will? Tabloids pounced on the story, splashing her photograph across their covers under cruel captions like, "The widow who knows too much." She could not walk into a restaurant without people lowering their voices. Friends drifted away. Strangers followed her in the street. Despite no evidence against her, suspicion became her daily reality. But Isabella was not the only one under fire. The three men linked to James and the plane became permanent fixtures in the rumor mill. Richard Hale, James's longtime business partner, carried the heaviest professional fallout. He had clashed with James in the months before the flight over a contract worth millions. Witnesses recalled loud arguments in the company office. One staffer remembered Richard shouting, "You're driving this company into the ground, James!" That single memory was enough to stain his reputation. Though Richard insisted he had been in Chicago on the day of the disappearance, his alibi was shaky. Business clients walked away. Contracts dissolved. Within 2 years, Richard had lost nearly everything. He was labeled in the press as a man with motive and no conscience. Once respected in New York business circles, he now struggled to keep his own company afloat. Victor Klein, an old university friend of Isabella's, faced humiliation of a different kind. It was rumored that he and Isabella had once been romantically involved, and that he still harbored feelings for her. The gossip worsened after a confrontation weeks before the flight. Witnesses recalled Victor and James arguing at a social gathering, Victor allegedly saying, "You don't deserve her." That single, heated remark snowballed into public suspicion that jealousy had played a role in the disappearance. The Whitman family distanced themselves from Victor. He was uninvited from gatherings, excluded from business networks, and quietly treated as an outcast. His own marriage began to crack under the weight of gossip. Eventually, it ended in divorce. A memory of James yelling at him just days earlier did not help. Witnesses recalled James's frustration over delays in maintenance. He had snapped at Michael, "If you can't do your job properly, I'll find someone who can." Those words, repeated in gossip circles, painted Michael as a man with a grudge. Within months, Michael's reputation in aviation collapsed. No one wanted to hire the mechanic accused, without evidence, of causing a wealthy man's death. He left the industry altogether. From then on, he carried the weight of an accusation he could never clear. By the late 1980s, the Whitman case had evolved from an urgent search to a dark, cultural obsession. Newspapers ran anniversary stories every July, usually accompanied by recycled photographs of the couple smiling at their wedding or standing beside the plane. The stories often included speculation about the three men. Headlines screamed, "3 men, 3 motives, no plane." The case became one of the most famous mysteries of the Northeast. Everyone seemed to have a theory. Some insisted the plane had crashed deep into the Appalachians, buried beyond recovery. Others claimed James had staged his own disappearance. Still others swore Isabella had orchestrated everything. The absence of facts allowed every rumor to thrive. But behind the sensationalism, the reality was quieter and crueler. Isabella lived under suspicion, her grief overshadowed by innuendo. Richard watched his business collapse. Victor lost his marriage and his reputation. Michael's career ended in disgrace. None of them had been charged with any crime. None of them had been proven guilty. Yet all four, the widow and the 3 men, lived under the shadow of an unsolved case. By the end of the decade, law enforcement officially reclassified the file as a cold case. There were no new leads, no more official search missions. The case was boxed, labeled, and shelved. For the Whitman family, this was intolerable. They still held vigils, still clung to hope. But hope faded with every year. Without answers, closure remained impossible. The last entry in the case file for that decade was chilling in its simplicity. Last radar contact, 5:42 p.m., July 10, 1984. The cold case file of James and Isabella Whitman sat frozen for more than 3 decades. And for nearly 40 years, no one could say with certainty what had really happened after 5:42 p.m. that summer evening. It was the fall of 2020 when the silence finally broke. A group of hunters moved through a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. The land was rugged, steep, and overgrown. Few people ever ventured there. While tracking deer, one of them noticed something unusual, a flash of silver metal sticking out from a rocky slope. At first, they thought it was just an old scrap, maybe wreckage from World War II. But as they pushed through the brush and cleared the mud from the surface, letters and numbers appeared. A faded registration code. One of the hunters recognized what it meant. It wasn't random debris. It was a plane. And not just any plane. Authorities were alerted immediately. Local survey teams arrived, then the Federal Aviation Administration was called in. Within hours, the wreckage was confirmed. The number on the fuselage matched the missing Cessna 210 owned by James Whitman, the same plane that had vanished from radar on July 10, 1984. After 36 years, the Whitman flight had been found. For decades, the case had haunted the Northeast. Newspapers once called it the perfect honeymoon flight gone cold. Families wanted closure, investigators wanted answers, and 3 men lived under suspicion. Yet no wreckage had ever surfaced. Until now. When teams made their way into the site, what they saw was eerie. The Cessna was lodged deep in a narrow gorge, hidden by decades of trees and vines. The wings had snapped, one lying yards away. The nose was driven hard into the ground. But the fuselage was remarkably intact. It looked as if the plane had gone straight down and stayed there, shielded from view by the mountain itself. Inside the cabin, the mystery turned even darker. 2 skeletons were recovered, seated at the front. The remains were fragile but still identifiable thanks to personal belongings. A leather wallet with credit cards. A wristwatch that had stopped decades earlier. Identity papers preserved in the wreckage. They belonged to James and Isabella Whitman. For families, the discovery brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that James and Isabella had been found, but grief all over again. Finally, they could be laid to rest. Finally, there was a grave, not just unanswered questions. The initial assumption seemed obvious. This was a tragic accident. James was a part-time pilot, certified but not seasoned. Maybe he lost control. Maybe weather conditions shifted. Perhaps the plane simply failed. The headline on national news was simple: "Missing plane found after 36 years." But the comfort of that answer did not last long. As forensic investigators examined the wreck, they noticed something strange. Damage on the plane was not consistent with the crash alone. In the cockpit, wires in the fuel system looked wrong. They weren't frayed or torn apart by impact. They were sliced, clean, straight cuts. One aviation mechanic on site put it bluntly: "That's not an accident. Somebody touched this before it ever left the ground. That single detail shifted everything. The Whitman mystery was no longer just about a plane lost in the wilderness. It was evidence of sabotage. Law enforcement reopened the Whitman file. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the missing plane was now a criminal investigation. Old boxes of documents were pulled out of storage. Interviews from the 1980s were reread. And those 3 names, whispered about for years. The discovery sparked national media attention. News anchors called it a cold case awakening. True crime programs raced to cover it. Journalists flooded North Carolina. And once again, the question was asked: who wanted James and Isabella gone? Families of the couple were caught between grief and suspicion. James's relatives spoke to reporters, saying they were thankful for answers, but stunned by the possibility that foul play had been involved all along. Isabella's surviving friends expressed the same disbelief. The case they had accepted as tragedy was now something else entirely: a crime. The 3 men who had carried the weight of rumor for years were shaken as well. Richard Hale, the former business partner, released a statement. "I lost everything once to this case. I don't want to live through that nightmare again." Victor Klein, once called Isabella's secret lover by tabloids, told a reporter, "I buried this part of my life decades ago. Please don't drag me back into it." And Michael Turner, the mechanic, refused to comment, though neighbors said he looked terrified when the story resurfaced. The reopening of the case felt like a movie playing in reverse. Suddenly the past was alive again. The party James and Isabella hosted days before the flight. The arguments about money. The fact that James had just revised his will. None of it seemed random anymore. Every detail was now treated as potential evidence. The discovery site itself became a landmark. Police tape surrounded the wreck. For weeks, forensic teams combed every inch: soil samples, wire fragments, metal shavings. Everything was bagged and cataloged. The bodies were taken to a lab for full autopsy. Even after decades, forensic science had advanced enough to pull new information from old remains. And one thing was clear. This was not weather, not pilot error, not misfortune. The Whitman plane had been tampered with. For the first time, investigators spoke openly about it. One detective summarized, "This wasn't just a missing plane. It was a setup. Someone wanted this flight to end in disaster." Theories flooded in. Was it about money? About love? About revenge? Everyone connected to the couple fell up. By the end of 2020, the Whitman case had gone from one of the Northeast's oldest missing plane stories to a full-scale criminal probe. Detectives promised to follow the new trail wherever it led. Forensic teams pledged to keep analyzing. And the public, once resigned to mystery, now demanded justice. The discovery of the wreck should have ended the story. Instead, it turned the page to the darkest chapter yet. After 36 years, the plane was no longer missing. But the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And the question everyone now asked was simple: who sabotaged the Whitman flight? And why? If a missing plane can reappear after 36 years with evidence of sabotage, what else can decades of silence still be hiding? In the next part, we'll dive into the forensic work that exposed the truth and the shocking trail that finally led investigators to the person responsible. What do you think? Was this about money, family, or something else entirely? Let us know. The wreckage had answered one question but opened 10 more. Forensic teams didn't waste time. Within days, specialists in aviation mechanics moved through the site piece by piece. They didn't just look at the twisted frame. They studied the heart of the plane, the cockpit and its systems. What they found shifted the case from tragedy to sabotage. The fuel system drew immediate attention. Wires and hoses that should have been torn randomly from the crash showed something different. They weren't frayed. They weren't ripped. They were cut. Straight, clean cuts. The kind you'd expect from a sharp tool in the hands of someone who knew exactly where to strike. One FAA specialist gave reporters a blunt assessment. This wasn't pilot error. This wasn't weather. This plane was sabotaged, no question. The conclusion was chilling. James Whitman had not lost control. Someone had made sure the plane would never stay in the air. Investigators shifted focus back to the estate was worth millions. Controlling shares of the import-export company, a townhouse in Manhattan, and several investment accounts. James had been the dominant figure in the family business. Emily had a smaller role, often in the background. But friends recalled how she clashed with her brother about money and control. One family acquaintance recalled, "Emily told me once that James dismissed her like she didn't matter. She said she wouldn't let him treat her that way forever." That wasn't the only sign. A retired airport worker came forward with a memory he had buried. In the week before the flight, he remembered seeing a woman near the hangar where James kept his Cessna. At the time, it hadn't seemed important. She looked out of place, but no one raised an alarm. Decades later, shown an old photograph, he hesitated but admitted, "It looked a lot like Emily." The pieces started to align. Sabotaged fuel lines, a bitter family feud, a will that placed Emily just one step away from a fortune. The investigation now had direction. Meanwhile, public opinion turned quickly. For years, suspicion had fallen on 3 men, Richard Hale, Victor Klein, and Michael Turner. Each of them had lived under a shadow that never lifted. But as news broke of the cut wires and the inheritance link, attention shifted away from them. The story in the headlines was no longer 3 men, 3 motives. It was family betrayal. Still, detectives didn't rush. They rebuilt the case carefully, making sure the technical findings would hold in court. They documented every cut wire, every tampered hose, every indication that the Cessna had been compromised long before it left the runway. They dug into bank records, tracing how Emily's financial position changed in the years after James's disappearance. She hadn't inherited everything immediately, but she had gained influence in the family company and access to assets Isabella never used. The drama was no longer just about a missing plane. It was about betrayal inside the Whitman family. The victim was not only James and Isabella. It was also the 3 men who had carried the weight of suspicion for decades. Richard Hale had lost contracts and credibility. Victor Klein's personal life had collapsed under whispers of an affair. Michael Turner had been branded a careless mechanic, forced out of his profession. Now, forensic science was finally lifting the blame from their shoulders. Reporters swarmed the story. Television anchors opened with lines like, "The Whitman plane wasn't lost to the mountains, it was lost to sabotage." Editorials called it a lesson in how rumors destroy lives, while the real culprit hides in plain sight. The Whitman family itself was torn apart. Some relatives refused to believe Emily could have been involved. Others admitted the fights between brother and sister had been bitter, sometimes explosive. One cousin recalled a heated exchange at a family gathering just months before the flight. James had told Emily she had no right to interfere in company business. She fired back that he was arrogant, selfish, and unfit to control the family fortune. Witnesses remembered her storming out, shouting, "One day you'll regret treating me like this." That quote, once dismissed as an outburst, now took on new weight. For investigators, the case was building toward a single conclusion. The crash wasn't random. The timing wasn't coincidence. The person with the most to gain, and the one with the skill and access to tamper with the plane before takeoff, was Emily Whitman. After nearly 40 years, the cold case had warmed into a firestorm. Detectives were no longer... It was the summer of 2022 when police cars pulled up outside a quiet home in New York. Emily Whitman, now 62 years old, opened the door. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs. Gray hair tied back, expression blank, she was led away while cameras rolled. The images hit the evening news within hours. The headline was blunt: Whitman's sister arrested in inheritance plane plot. For decades, the disappearance of James and Isabella had been one of the Northeast's longest-running mysteries. Now, almost 40 years later, it was about to be played out in a federal courtroom. The trial drew enormous attention. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Inside, every seat was filled. Family members of James and Isabella carried framed photos of the couple, placing them where everyone could see. For the press, this was not just another trial. It was a cold case reborn, one of the most important courtroom battles of the decade. The prosecution began with a clear statement. This was not an accident. This was sabotage, designed to look like tragedy. They walked the jury through the chain of evidence. The fuel lines of the Cessna had been cut cleanly with a sharp tool. Aviation experts testified that such cuts were deliberate, placed in an area only someone with mechanical knowledge would reach. This plane was sabotaged, one FAA specialist told the court. No question. Next came the financial records. James had rewritten his will only months before the flight. Isabella was the primary heir, but Emily stood next in line. If both James and Isabella were gone, Emily would inherit a fortune in property, stocks, and company shares. The prosecutor reminded the jury, Emily Whitman had motive, access, and opportunity. They added witness testimony. A man who once worked at the hangar recalled seeing a woman resembling Emily near James's plane days before the flight. At the time, no one thought much of it. Decades later, it became a critical piece of the puzzle. And then came the family conflict. Records and statements showed James and Emily had argued repeatedly over money and control of the family business. One longtime friend remembered hearing Emily say, "James thinks he can control me forever." They questioned the reliability of the mechanical evidence, suggesting that wires could have been damaged by time, weather, or the crash itself. They argued that the witness who placed Emily near the hangar had seen her only briefly, in poor light, and could easily be mistaken. And they hammered the same point again and again. No one had ever seen Emily touch the plane. No fingerprints. No tool marks tied directly to her. No confession. "There is no direct evidence," the defense repeated. "No murder weapon, no eyewitness, nothing beyond doubt." The courtroom grew tense as expert after expert took the stand. A forensic aviation mechanic displayed photographs of the sliced fuel lines. "These cuts are straight, deliberate, and made before impact," he explained. The jury stared as enlarged images of the wires filled the screen. Then a family acquaintance testified about Emily's long history of resentment. "She once told me," he said quietly, "James doesn't respect me. He'll pay for it one day." Gasps moved through the courtroom. Emily sat expressionless, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Outside the courthouse, the case dominated national headlines. Newspapers called it the inheritance plane plot. Talk shows compared Emily to infamous killers motivated by money. Some commentators asked why it had taken nearly 4 decades for investigators to bring her to trial. Others debated whether cold cases could ever deliver true justice. Public opinion was divided. Some felt sympathy for Emily, suggesting years of family pressure had twisted her into desperation. Most saw it more simply: a greedy sister who cut down her own family for money. For James's relatives, the trial was agony. They listened quietly, clutching photographs as the evidence unfolded. On the courthouse steps, one family member told reporters, "We waited almost 40 years to hear 3 words: guilty of murder." After 2 weeks of testimony and cross-examination, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 6 hours. When they returned, the room fell silent. Emily Whitman was found guilty of first-degree murder through the act of aircraft sabotage. The judge delivered the sentence firmly: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial ended the question of what happened to James and Isabella. But it raised another one. How many lives had been destroyed in the long wait for truth? It took nearly 4 decades, but the Whitman family finally learned the truth. For years they had lived with silence, rumors, and endless speculation. Now, with the trial over and Emily Whitman convicted, they were able to bury James and Isabella in a formal service. Mourners filled the church. Photographs of the couple stood at the front, framed with flowers. A relative spoke quietly. "We spent a lifetime waiting to hear the truth." The words carried the weight of generations who had lived in uncertainty. For others, the outcome meant something different. Richard Hale once branded the ruthless business partner. Victor Klein, accused of being Isabella's secret lover. Michael Turner, painted as the careless mechanic. They had carried the shadow of suspicion for nearly 40 years. In the eyes of the public, they were suspects first, human beings second. Careers were destroyed, marriages ended, friendships dissolved. Even when cleared, the damage was irreversible. They became living reminders of how destructive suspicion and rumor can be. The Whitman case quickly became a cornerstone in criminology courses. Law schools, aviation programs, and police academies used it as a case study. It showed how cold cases could still be solved, not by luck alone, but through persistence, forensic science, and a willingness to reopen old files. Instructors pointed to the importance of preserving evidence even when cases seem impossible. Students studied the photographs of the fuel lines, the testimony of the aviation experts, and the financial records that exposed a hidden motive. The lesson was clear. Time does not erase the truth, it only delays it. The aviation world also took notice. The Federal Aviation Administration reviewed regulations for private planes. New security checks were added to hangars, even for small personal aircraft. Maintenance logs became stricter, inspections more rigorous. The case proved that sabotage was not just a threat to commercial airlines, but to private aviation as well. It was a wake-up call. Every aircraft, no matter its size, carried the same risk when oversight failed. The public reaction was intense. The case appeared on talk shows, documentaries, and national headlines. Journalists revisited old articles, highlighting how decades of false suspicion had ruined lives. Commentators debated the role of money, family pressure, and greed in shaping tragedy. The phrase "inheritance plain plot" stuck, a grim label that captured the mix of wealth, betrayal, and death. For many, it became a cautionary tale about the cost of secrecy and the destructive power of rumor. But the story did not end in the courtroom. In New York, the family organized an annual memorial. Every summer, people gathered to honor James and Isabella. Candles were lit, prayers read, and stories shared. A scholarship fund was established in their names, supporting business students in James's field and design students in Isabella's. It was a small but meaningful way to transform loss into something that helped others. Their names lived on, not just as victims of tragedy, but as a source of opportunity for the next generation. The final chapter of the Whitman case left the world with 3 lasting lessons. First, greed can tear apart even the closest families, leading to consequences far beyond money. Second, suspicion and rumor can destroy innocent lives just as powerfully as a crime itself. And third, justice, though delayed, is never truly lost. The system may move slowly, evidence may lie hidden for decades, but the truth has a way of resurfacing. In the end, the story closed with an image that spoke louder than any headline. At a quiet cemetery in New York, a double headstone was placed for James and Isabella Whitman. The inscription was simple: